Can I get a sense, first of all, who in here actually thinks they want to be an investigative journalist? Is there anybody who wants to be an investigative journalist? So I see a few hands going up, but what are the rest of you going to do? Well, the thing is, if you're going to go into journalism, then I hope that you spend at least some time doing investigative journalism, because it should come into whatever you're doing. We were just talking earlier about sports journalism, about which I know nothing. I'm not a sports journalist at all, but I think it's become pretty clear in recent years the abject failure of sports journalism to uncover some massive scandals which are slowly being uncovered now. Has to be said, not really by sports journalists, it's by people who are investigative journalists specifically. You wonder what the sports journalists were doing. They weren't looking, were they? They are exciting times right now for both journalism and journalists, and investigative journalists in particular, somewhat contrary to popular notion. This springs out of a very bad time for journalism, where really quite serious flaws have become apparent with the way journalism has been practiced in this country in particular for some time. There's been a growing trend for journalists to spend their time rewriting press releases or just going to briefings given by spin doctors and writing them up as if somehow they were worth doing, as if they were the truth, as if they meant anything to readers. What has come to be known as journalism, really quite different from journalism. The other thing that's really emerged as a scandal of our trade has been the widespread use of what I call the dark arts of journalism, which come in different forms. There are, I suppose, two particular forms that are noteworthy. One is the practice of bin raiding, which I actually wrote a book about 10 years ago, which was before the phone hacking scandal, about the practice of certain journalists to get their stories simply by raiding bins. And although there can be a place for that, in fact, if it's in the public interest, if you've got something to go for, the methodology had really become the way of doing it. And it wasn't just tabloid journalists doing it by any means. Certainly some of the broadsheets, such as The Guardian, liked to engage in that in the past. And the other dark art, which has really, I suppose, traumatized certain parts of the industry, or the exposure of it has been phone hacking. Basically led to the closure of the News of the World. And again, a bit like bin raiding, there might, in certain circumstances, be grounds for doing it if there's a clear public interest in a specific case, but it became a routine thing to do just to trawl for material, and in general, the material that was being uncovered wasn't really in the public interest. It was just sort of tittle-tattle celebrity nonsense. The root of this malaise, you might say, journalists are terrible people for doing all this kind of thing, but actually the real villain of the piece, which is often overlooked, are accountants. And the reason why it's accountants is because they thought it was a very clever idea to have newsrooms of journalists, first of all, sat at their desks as if they were working in a bank, rewriting press releases, perhaps arranging for phones to be hacked, rather than doing, as it were, real journalism, because it's basically much cheaper and much more certain in terms of results. So it is a malaise that's born out of a kind of cost-cutting mentality that's set in to the media industry, which in turn has come about because we have something of a broken business model. A lot of the traditional forms of media, whether it be local newspapers, national newspapers, and even broadcasters, are finding themselves seriously challenged in the evolving media world. And that has exacerbated in recent years the demand for cost-cutting, which in turn has led to some dubious practices. But we've kind of come through that in the sense that the exposure of those dubious practices has left a realization that we can't be doing that anymore. And it's also part of the reason why there's been something of a resurgence of traditional investigative journalism, because the dark arts just won't do. So the broken business model and the malaise that there's been in journalism has actually given rise to new opportunities, which have come up in various different forms. You could sort of imagine the big trees in the forest, the old media is, the trees are falling down, and it's giving space, as it were, for saplings, new saplings to rise. Now, I don't think, I'm often asked, what is the silver bullet for the broken business model and for broken journalism in Britain? And I don't think there is a silver bullet. What I think there is, or what there are, is a multitude of new opportunities that are arising. There's a kind of multitude of solutions to the problem. Some of the solutions, though, do have real hazards. One of the things that's grown is the growth of companies and NGOs, non-government organisations and the like, fed up as they often are with journalists and journalism, kind of trying to do it themselves. Now, I hope you can immediately see what the problem with that is. It does, on the one hand, actually represent some opportunities for journalists. For example, I know Greenpeace is just setting up an investigative journalistic unit. I know at least one of my friends is doing some work for that. So there is work there for journalists, but of course the problem with it is that it's not really coming from an independent perspective, and in a sense it's giving rise to a new form of journalism where it's not just press releases that are being rewritten by the mainstream media, but the research that may have been carried out by a company or an NGO. And the problem with it is you don't really necessarily know where it's coming from. It doesn't meet the test of independence. But there are also a lot of new media organisations that are springing up in this sort of changed climate. And some of them are dedicated to real journalism. I think it probably would be right to say it started with ProPublica in America, which is a philanthropic funded organisation, which is also in itself can be problematic, the nature of that funding, but it has made some useful contributions to journalism, particularly in the States. And it brings me to Exaro. What is the story of Exaro? Well, Exaro was very much born in that climate of a broken business model for the media on the whole, and for the malaise that has set in within journalism. And originally I was approached by a small project team to help put together effectively a proposal, an investment proposal, for an investigative website that would do real journalism. So Exaro actually launched about 4 years ago, and it is different from ProPublica in that it does have a commercial aim, although it's not breaking even at this stage, and it's going to be a long while before it does that. But it's not philanthropically funded. It is a commercial enterprise with the, I suppose, ultimate aim that it will fund itself, so it will be self-sustaining. Now, Exaro has mostly people working for it who come from the mainstream media. We do also, as Nigel said, take on student journalists. We've taken on quite a few over the 4 years of our existence, both in terms of placements, but also in terms of just working for us. What we typically do is someone might come and work a few shifts for us to sort of get a sense of the nature of the work, and more work from that may flow. But most of the journalists working for us are, in fact, from the mainstream media. I started off, actually not so far from here, on an evening newspaper in Hull, the Hull Daily Mail, and went from there to work for a couple of different national newspapers, the Sunday Express and then the Sunday Telegraph, and then went into television, worked for World in Action, which was in many ways at the time, the premier place to work as an investigative journalist. Of course, the program no longer exists. And I also worked for Yorkshire Television Documentaries, although I was based in London, but I'd come up here just down the road to edit programs in Leeds. I went back to World in Action specifically to make a program. It was the second of 2 programs about Jonathan Aitken, who is a former Defence Procurement Minister, who we revealed had in his business days actually worked for a defence company that had tried to sell arms to both sides of the Iran-Iraq war at a time when you weren't supposed to be doing that. And in the case of Iran, actually succeeded in supplying naval guns via Singapore. That resulted in the rather infamous libel case, which in turn saw Aitken jailed for perjury. I then ended up, as it were, working for Exaro. So I've kind of worked through all the main media, I suppose, newspapers, television, and now online. And we, as I say, most of the other journalists working for Exaro are from a similar background, mostly newspaper journalists. We have, for example, David Henke, a long-time Westminster correspondent of The Guardian, who exposed the Cash for Questions story. We have John Davison, ex-The Sunday Times, where he broke the Pergal Dam scandal, which was about alleged corruption surrounding a massive overseas contract. And I suppose because we do have, we're not really a mainstream media outlet, so I suppose we're kind of sometimes seen as that, but we're not officially, I don't think, but we mostly have mainstream media journalists working for us. And in the 4 years of our existence so far, we've had a phenomenal impact. And I'm just going to take you through a few of the stories that we've done, which I'm sure you would have heard of. The first big story that Exaro broke became known as the Whitehall Tax Scandal. And this was the practice of senior civil servants working off payroll through personal service companies as a mechanism to enable them to avoid paying tax, or as we often worded it, it allowed them to choose how much tax they wanted to pay. And we kicked that off with a guy called Ed Lester. Some of you may know him. He was, at the time, chief executive of the Student Loans Company. And it seems astonishing to us that you could be chief executive of a public body, but not be on the payroll. And that was the first one that we exposed, the first example that we exposed. And it's worth just saying how that came about. It was a story that was broken by David Henke, and it came about initially because of a contact of his, a confidential contact. We never revealed who he was, and it started off with a conversation in a Whitehall pub, and this contact was absolutely livid with what he said was a widespread practice of civil servants working off payroll in order to choose how much tax they wanted to pay. And he guided us to the specific example of Ed Lester. And of course, you can't do much with that. One source telling you this outrageous scandal, you couldn't possibly go and publish on the strength of that. But it is enough to know that you can start digging, which of course is, as you said, Nigel, what we're called. So off we went, and David made a series of FOIA requests under the Freedom of Information Act, in order to try and prise out of the Student Loans Company the necessary information about the contract negotiations. And initially, as quite often happens with FOIA requests, we got a kind of a rebuff. But because we had our insider, we were able to go back to our source and say, where are we going wrong? What have we not quite got right in our question? So the source was able to give us a bit more guidance on how to reframe the FOIA request, because you do have to be incredibly clever to make them work, or not clever, you need an insider. You can't be clever enough all too often. And it kind of opened the Pandora's box. In fact, we were quite astonished by just how much it released. We got the full details of the contract negotiations, the full details of the contract, quite frankly, a lot more than we ever would have expected. And it certainly absolutely, beyond any shadow of a doubt, proved comprehensively that this is what was going on, that this chief executive of the Student Loans Company wasn't on the payroll, and that he was being paid through a personal service company. Moreover, there was a lot of toing and froing between civil servants and even ministers, and we established that it went all the way to Gus O'Donnell, who was then the Cabinet Secretary, who approved the arrangement. But we could also tell from the documentation, it had been very easy for us to have kicked the relevant minister, who was Douglas Alexander at the time. He had formally approved the contract, but it was clear to us from the documents that he actually had the wool pulled over his eyes and didn't know. He wasn't told about the tax arrangements. When we broke the story, quite a lot of things happened. First of all, there was an urgent debate, and we actually broke it with Newsnight. So quite often what we do at Exaro, we'll team up with other outlets, which is mainly about amplifying the story. So we teamed up with Newsnight. It went out one particular night, and literally the following day there was an emergency debate in the House of Commons, so it's always good to see your story have an immediate impact. Douglas Alexander, probably mightily relieved that we had pointed out that the wool was pulled over his eyes and he wasn't actually really to blame, he ordered an immediate review at the Treasury of how widespread this practice was. Because, of course, we thought this practice was widespread, but we didn't know that it was. Certainly our source told us that it was. We had one cast iron extraordinary example. But we carried on working away and we soon found other examples. But at the same time as that, the Treasury carried out its own review. And of course, as you'd expect Exaro to do, we got the leak on what the Treasury found before they could tell anyone else about it. And it came up with the astonishing conclusion that there wasn't just the one, as we knew full well, senior civil servant who was doing this. There were 2,400 of them. And it was an example of the scandal just got bigger and bigger. We kept finding specific examples, some particularly extraordinary examples, crazy amounts of money being spent, crazy amounts of tax being avoided, enormous numbers of people exploiting this loophole. And it caused, in the end, a huge clampdown from the Treasury. And I think there were some calculations on how much tax was paid as a result of the work that we did, and it was many millions, that's for sure, out of these civil servants who weren't quite paying the tax that they should have been. So it's always good to see a story not just be followed up by the rest of the media, as that one certainly was. I know we ended up leading Newsnight on, I think, 3 nights in a row on that single story as we found more developments, as new things came to light, and just the reaction, as it were, from both the rest of the media, but also by the authorities, in this case the Treasury, the government, in responding to what we had exposed. And you can see why it is that civil servants in particular, even more than ministers, really don't like the Freedom of Information Act. Because for sure, if we didn't have the Freedom of Information Act, we simply would not have been able to expose the story in the way that we did. Of course, we had a great source. It turned out our source was bang on the money, but we could never have run it on the strength of that. And it gives you some insight as to why civil servants really don't like the Freedom of Information Act. They like to be able to do things in secret because they like to, for example, have cosy tax arrangements that suit them, if not the rest of us. The next big story that we ran at Exaro was the exposure of a massive contract, a defense contract with Saudi Arabia. It's a contract to overhaul the Saudi National Guard's military communications systems, a contract that has a sort of headline value of about £2 billion over the course of many years. It runs in parallel with another contract called Al Yamama, on which the media has actually thrown the spotlight over many years. World in Action program I used to work for used to exist, exposed corruption surrounding that contract. Well, we found evidence of bribery that surrounded the SANCOM contract, this military communications contract. We had a whistleblower who went on the record. We had some documentation that, at least on their face, appeared to show money being diverted to curious offshore companies. And that story caused the Serious Fraud Office to launch a criminal investigation, which is still going on. The Serious Fraud Office is not one of the most effective law enforcement agencies in the world, and I'm not sure whether it'll in the end get anywhere, but it did nonetheless cause a criminal investigation. And again, it's a very tricky story to expose, really quite complicated, because the money routes are deliberately made so, because they obviously want to not just keep them away from prying eyes of journalists, they also want to keep them away from the prying eyes of law enforcement agencies. And then we exposed a rather extraordinary secret recording of one Rupert Murdoch talking to a group of his journalists, and revealing the fact that he knew, he told them that he was well aware of the practice of his journalists paying bribes to officials for information, for stories. And he said he knew this ever since he'd bought the News of the World back in 1967. Now, we did that story with Channel 4 News. I think, again, it led the programme on 3 consecutive nights. The story had an immediate impact. It was followed up around the world. And one of the consequences of it was that the police contacted us because they wanted the audio. Now, we actually didn't have the entire audio, although we'd listened to it. We were initially offered by a source a transcript. And I said, well, that's not really enough. We need the audio. Because one, we need to check the transcript is accurate. And I was also well aware the story would take off much more if we had the audio rather than just the transcript. Well, the source was very nervous about this and allowed us in the end to listen to the entire audio, and also allowed us to have the excerpts of Murdoch speaking, which was enough to really make the story work, because obviously from a television point of view, actually being able to hear the guy speaking, saying what he was saying, obviously has so much more impact than just seeing the words written on a page or written online. So the police contacted us to ask whether they could have the audio, and we said, well, we've only got audio clips and they're all up on the website, so you can hear them all there. They said, well, it would be helpful if we could just have them on a USB or something, because it makes it easier for us to sort of copy the files and pass them around as we might need to do. But it meant that what became clear in all this exchange was that that story caused the police to expand the investigation they were, of course, already doing into alleged bribery of journalists, into the knowledge, the corporate knowledge, and Murdoch's knowledge in particular, of that practice. So it sparked a police investigation into him specifically. Not clear at the moment where that's going, because it's interesting to see that a lot of the reporters who were charged with paying bribes to officials, while we've seen various officials being convicted of taking bribes, the journalists on the whole argued that what they were doing was paying for information for stories that were in the public interest. And it's been very interesting to see that juries have, on the whole, accepted that. And if you look at the list of stories that, in particular, it's the Sun, journalists were revealing as a consequence of paying officials, you can certainly see in very many of the cases they were quite right. These were stories that were in the public interest. And although I would have thought technically that probably isn't a defence in law, thankfully we have the jury system in this country, and juries are a bit more sensible, quite frankly, than a lot of people like the CPS and the police on those kinds of matters. So it's been interesting to see how that's unfolded, and it's unclear at the moment to what extent, if any, the authorities are going to look at Murdoch's personal culpability in any of those activities. And finally, the other story that Exaro has become quite well known for has been an investigation we've been doing now over about 3 years, which is uncovering evidence of several prominent people who sexually abused children, boys and girls, over a long period of time. And moreover, evidence that at various points, police investigations into those activities were closed down, and closed down for, as it were, improper reasons. That work that we have done has so far led to several police investigations being launched, and perhaps the most high profile of them all is called Operation Midlands, which is the investigation specifically into the claim that 3 boys were murdered by this network. These are historical allegations. 3 boys were murdered, as well as sexual abuse and as well as torture. And the police are currently working on that. They regard the evidence that we found as credible. That's not the same as saying that that is proven, but there's credible evidence that that happened, and that is at the base of one police investigation. But perhaps more significantly, we also managed through another confidential source to gain access to a private online forum in which former police officers and indeed current police officers chat, talk. They think they're, and they generally are, just talking amongst themselves, as it were, amongst fellow former or current police officers. And the reason we were given access is because there was several conversation threads that was about this subject, and several of these officers were swapping anecdotes of how either they or their colleagues had been working on operations, investigations in the past, police operations, into such allegations, and how they were pulled by someone on high for quite improper reasons. Really quite extraordinary material. And a couple of things happened. One, we ran a lot of it. We actually quite deliberately kept all their names anonymous. We obviously know who they were, but we deliberately decided to keep them anonymous kind of for their own protection, because they weren't, of course, whistleblowers that come forward to us. They were talking in a private context. But we also, I suppose, encouraged them to submit their information to the Met, because most of this did concern the Metropolitan Police, Scotland Yard in London. And that had quite a major consequence, because the Met sort of realised that they have got a real problem, real issue with this welter of evidence about these past closed investigations. So the Met actually referred a lot of these cases to the IPCC, which is tasked with regulating what the police does, and there's big questions over whether it's much good at doing that, but nonetheless that's its job. And the IPCC, I think the Met to date has referred 29 separate cases of closed operations that were allegedly closed corruptly into prominent people. And they've been referred, in fact they've referred more than that, but 29 have been referred, and the IPCC has accepted that they'll oversee investigations into those, and there are 2 others for other police forces outside of London. So the IPCC is currently investigating in total 31 examples of allegations that police operations, police investigations into MPs and other prominent people, investigations into allegations of sexual abuse by them, child sex abuse, were closed down improperly in the past. Of course, it's unclear where that's going to go, but it's noteworthy that that evidence has come from former police officers. So we have a combination of both people who say they were abused themselves as children, as well as former police officers. And I suppose the story has had massive consequences in terms of new police operations being set up, the IPCC looking at past investigations that were closed down, and it's also caused a national inquiry into the whole issue, which is going to try to pull together, it was initially aimed to be overarching, to pull together various elements, everything from problems at the BBC over this issue, through politics, through religious organisations, etc., etc. One of the things that's, I suppose, also noteworthy about this whole story is, as is probably true with all of them, is they do point up, where's the media been? I sort of started off talking about how, sports journalists seem to have not been paying attention to what was going on in fields that they're supposed to cover. Until some other journalists came along to expose massive corruption in FIFA, alleged doping scandals left, right and centre. And so it is in all areas of where journalists operate. I had on the periphery some involvement in the MP's expenses story, not the Telegraph stuff. I was one of the journalists who was doing material on that subject before the Telegraph did what it did. And I can tell you that whenever you put up a story about MPs fiddling their expenses to a news desk, the reaction would always be, they'd go and talk to the political editor of the relevant paper, and the reaction would always be from the lobby correspondent, oh, we all know that goes on, it's not a story. Well, it turned out that when the public was told exactly what was going on, they had a rather different view of it. And I think it just shows the extent to which people who probably don't think they are investigative journalists, and they're right about that, but it shows an astonishing shortcoming. If you were a lobby journalist working in Westminster, and one, didn't know anything about the fiddling of expenses, and two, didn't think that that warranted reporting, then I don't know what you're doing in your job. And I think you'll find that's true in lots of other areas too. So if all these former police officers who are talking about these closed operations left, right, and centre were going on, you have to ask yourself, where have journalists been? Because this is not stuff that's happened over the last year or two. These are scandals that go back decades. And it looks like in some cases we're talking back at least as far as the 60s. And it does raise real questions about, our trade and what the hell it's been doing if this kind of thing has been going on and it apparently went unnoticed. I think I'm going to sort of pause there and see if anyone wants to ask any questions. Since you're all budding journalists, I'm sure you must have some. Sorry, who's that? Is that you? Yeah. I couldn't hear.
Does it take a toll on your life being an investigative?
Does it take a toll on your life? Well, it's quite hard work. I think if you're an investigative journalist, it is hard work. You're probably working crazy hours. You're doing crazy things in terms of seeing people, talking to people and seeing people at all sorts of peculiar times, peculiar meeting places. And I think perhaps you're really thinking about the subject matter. Might be a bit traumatic, which, it does depend what it is. If you're investigating MPs' expenses, that's one level of trauma, but it's, but if you're talking to people who suffer child sex abuse, obviously that's, it's very, very tough indeed. So you've got to be committed to it because, it's not like doing most jobs. I think I wouldn't go so far as it takes a toll on your life, but, it kind of is your life, I would say. I saw someone vaguely putting up their hand. Yeah, sorry.
You had a bit of a dig at sports journalists with regard to FIFA.
Say again?
A bit of a dig at sports journalists regarding FIFA, the scandal. I think it was to do with self-censorship and some people were too close to them. They didn't want to lose their chumming.
That's absolutely true. That is absolutely true. And that happens at sort of every level. So if you might be a sports journalist on an evening newspaper where you're reliant on access to the local football club or whatever, and you constantly have this problem of to what extent can you do them over? Can you expose something that's embarrassing to the club? And to what extent is that going to spoil your relationship so you're going to be cut out of the loop? And that's kind of how the news is manipulated. And the mainstream media on the whole is so falls prey to being manipulated. So we have this in the political context. We have the lobby system where stories are kind of doled out from the government essentially to whoever's in favour, and it's kind of traded. So if one day you've done something that the government doesn't like, or a particular spin doctor doesn't like, or a particular minister doesn't like, you're not going to get the next sweetie when it's being handed out. And similarly for, say, the sports journalist covering a football club. And one of the solutions to this, actually, I worked, amongst many places, I worked for Sunday Business where we had an investigations unit. And the editor of that paper was a guy called Jeff Randall, who went on to become BBC's business editor and then presented a business programme for Sky News. And when I didn't really know him, although we'd both worked at the Sunday Times, he was on business and I think sport for a while and I was on news. So I think we'd met, but we didn't really know each other. And when he interviewed me and said, I think I do want you to run our investigations unit. And he said, the thing is, I don't know anything about investigative journalism, Jeff said. He said, I just know I need some. In fact, he was kind of doing himself down a bit because he's not an investigative journalist, but he's a bloody good reporter. And actually, that's all an investigative journalist is or should be. But what he said was what he wanted at Sunday Business, and this was actually quite sensible for someone who claimed to know nothing about investigative journalism. He said, I want you in one corner, upsetting, Company X as much as you like. Do them over. While I'll have my city editor over here, who is going out for lunch every other week with the chief executive. And he can say, I don't know what those guys are doing, nothing to do with me. And it's that kind of difference. And it means that he very cleverly, and it worked actually, would have the best of both worlds. So you'd have me, for example, exposing Railtrack as it was then, as a company that was heading for a crash. And in fact, Jeff was the guy at our place who had, was having the regular lunches with the chief executive, telling him it was all nonsense, as, a chief executive would inevitably do. And he was telling him that right up until about 2 weeks before it duly crashed. So you need both, because if you're the person who has the great relationship with chief executive, you might get stories of some sort with them, but they're not necessarily, they might not know everything. He might not have known the scale of the problems in his own company. But even if they do, they're not going to tell you. The investigative journalist is going to find stuff out that you, with your relationships, won't find out. You need different level of sources. And I suppose if you're in the one situation, if you're the one person, say, relating to the local football club, and that's your job to cover it, to what extent can you do them over? Well, that is an art, and it can be done, but it's quite tricky. Did anyone else have? Yes, fire away.
I was going to ask about how long would it take you to do your digging or your research into, say, something like the senior civil servants cheating on their taxes? How long will the digging take to do?
Yeah, the answer is quite a long time. It was a matter of months. So I think from the first tip to the first exposure of the particular example, the chief executive of the student loans company, it took months. And part of the time, of course, you're not working all the time. There's quite often with investigative stories, there's a bit like making wine. They have to kind of just mature in the corner. You can't not necessarily working on them constantly or full time. So, for example, you might make a FOIA request and you're waiting for the answer to come back. You may be doing something else in parallel, but I think with that one, we essentially made the FOIA request. The answer came back after a while, so that took some time, and then we had to go and see the source to get some advice about how to recraft it, which we duly did, sent it off again. Some time elapsed before we got the response, the positive response, and got this sort of wodge of material. And of course, then we had to actually read the wodge of material and make sense of it. And even though we're quite clever, there were things that we couldn't make head nor tail of. So you've got to find an expert who will help you navigate. So you've got to find a friendly accountant in this case to kind of help you make sense of it. So it does take time. And of course, one of the things that you have to do with a story like that, and this is true in reporting generally, but this is on a slightly bigger scale perhaps than normal, is you've kind of got to distill this material that is probably quite complicated in some senses. You've got to make it make sense to your audience. So first of all, you've got to understand it yourself, really got to understand it. And you've got to be able to tell the story in a way that will make sense. And when we did the report on Newsnight, although it was the lead item and it was very long, it was a 12-minute package or whatever, which is long by Newsnight standards. So you've really got to crystallize it. So that process takes a lot of work. It takes a lot of time.
How do you see the future of the FOI? Do you think there is a genuine threat to it?
Well, the future for FOIA, I'm worried about. As you may know, the government is conducting a review of how FOIA is working, which is essentially an exercise in working out how we can nobble it. As I say, people in power do not like FOIA because those of us who like to hold people to account find it useful. There are shortcomings with it as a tool, but it is nonetheless a tool in the toolbox. To cast your mind back to what Tony Blair said after he stopped being Prime Minister, his one great regret of his time as Prime Minister was introducing FOIA. It wasn't Iraq, it was introducing FOIA. So the government is now got this group of people who are reviewing it, and as far as we can work out, they're all predisposed to wanting to nobble FOIA. And they'll pretend they're not, but they will. And we'll have to see exactly what course it flows down. I mean, there will be strong opposition to it because I do have a sense. I mean, I've spoken to quite a lot of very senior journalists on national newspapers, and there's quite a bit of anger about it actually. And so we may find the likes of the Daily Mail and the Sun, suddenly campaigning on the issue, and that might make it politically difficult for the government to do what it certainly wants to do. Yeah, sure.
What did you make of the Panorama on the paedophile ring? Because it implied a lack of confidence in your research.
Yes, well, the Panorama was very muddled. It was kind of hard to work out what exactly they were saying. They were casting aspersions essentially on various witnesses who are essentially abuse survivors and who are, in fact, complainants in live criminal cases. And I mean, it was very irresponsible what they did, in my view. And certainly the police came out with an astonishingly strong statement just ahead of the Panorama, because they knew what was coming, because allegations had been put to them. And they pointed out that the credibility of a particular witness is not something for anyone to be speculating about at this stage in proceedings. And I think this is often missed. If you look at all the coverage that we have had on the subject, we've avoided saying that, you know, person X their account is definitely true, because this is something that's subject to a live criminal investigation. In a sense, the test as to whether we've run it is whether or not it's credible. And it seems, well, the police have publicly said on some of certainly the key material that's at the centre of Operation Midland, that they, like us, regard it as credible. We've avoided saying it's true, because that's inappropriate to do at this stage, in just the same way as it's inappropriate to say that it's false. And Panorama sort of tried to do that, which I think was fundamentally wrong. And I can tell you that there's fury within the BBC about it, about the way that they treated the subject. It clearly is going to put off other witnesses coming forward. Certainly some have told us that if they hadn't already come forward to police, they wouldn't be coming forward in the wake of that, because it was perceived as an attack on abuse survivors. I know Panorama denies that it was, but that's certainly how it was perceived, it's certainly how it came across. And of all organisations to be embarking on that, you know, you couldn't make it up, could you? I mean, the BBC, we all know, obviously has this massive problem with the history of Jimmy Savile, and it turns out, of course, not just Jimmy Savile. And there's been a very large review that's been conducted into this, carried out by a retired judge, was commissioned by the BBC to investigate this, and her review was finished ages ago, and it's just sitting there unpublished. And the reason it's sitting there unpublished is because it's an absolute bombshell for the BBC, and it's very, very worried that it will be used as a stick to beat it. And I fear that that may happen, not least because I think there's the kind of political climate seems to be a bit against them at the moment, and I personally would hope that these two things are kept separate, but it probably won't be. And it's just remarkable that the BBC, in the situation that it is in, as far from a disinterested party, could have embarked on the exercise that it did, and that's a common view within the BBC.
Well, yeah, if I can just come off the back of that and throw in another controversial, similar question. I was taught 25 years ago by a very good editor, always believe cock-up before conspiracy. And I must admit, when I first started to see all this stuff unravel about Leon Britton and politicians and police chiefs, and this sort of suggesting that there was some kind of massive conspiracy, that left an element of doubt in my mind. And I wonder what you would say about the danger of getting sucked into conspiracy theories.
Yeah, I think the danger is to oversimplify what went on. So, for example, there is very good evidence that a whole string of operations were closed down, but that's not the same thing as saying there was sort of, you know, one all-pervasive, all-powerful figure that was going around doing that in each case. And we know quite a bit about some of those operations that were closed down, and we know quite a bit about the mechanics of how it happened. So I think the danger is in a huge oversimplification. So you know, when in a specific case an order has come down to close an operation, the reason why that order has been passed on is simply because the person further up the chain told him to do it. Exactly why is not necessarily even clear to us. So I think the danger is in oversimplification. And if you take an organisation like the Met, I think there's also a danger of seeing an organisation as being completely homogenous. So even now, as we sit here today, there's been a big cultural change at the Met on this issue. They realise this is a problem. They realise they've not handled this issue well in the past, and realise they have to change and take it seriously. But that's not the same as saying everyone at the Met thinks that. There is a widespread view that that's the case, but there are others who think what you've just suggested, that the pendulum has swung too far. So there's kind of mixed opinions even within the Met, and actually the BBC is the same. So clearly the Panorama sitting there thinking the pendulum swung too far the other way. That's what Panorama thinks. But over at Newsnight or over at BBC News more generally, as opposed to Current Affairs, they don't think that.
Is it worrying that your company seems to be the only media
So I didn't really quite hear that.
Is it quite worrying for the future of journalism that your company seems like the only true public watchdog, like the fourth estate as it was described, the only person holding those comparative account compared to newspapers who are quite close to governments and not actually digging up stories like your company does?
Yeah, well, I suppose it is, but I wouldn't write off the rest of the media completely. And I mean, I think a turning point came in the wake of all the phone hacking and the bin raiding and all of that. The sort of big development in this field was the Telegraph's purchase, it has to be said, but their work that resulted in the exposure of MPs' expenses. And of course, that was a story that showed that all those lobby correspondents that said this wasn't a story of much interest to anyone, because we all know it's going on. It showed that was wrong because there was outrage, real public outrage about that. And of course, it made everyone realise, remember, again, oh, this investigative journalism is quite good, isn't it? The public likes it. They're interested in this stuff. They don't want to read about the trivial nonsense that newspapers generally have been filling themselves with. It suddenly reminded everyone that investigative journalism is really interesting if done well. And the Telegraph executed that very well. So it would be a mistake to say, no one else is doing anything, because the Telegraph did that, which I think did remind everyone of the value of investigative journalism and the point of doing it from a media's point of view. And in that time, we've had, I suppose, there have been several big stories that British media outlets have exposed. Probably a lot of them have been us, but there has been Snowden, which The Guardian did with the New York Times. There was the Sunday Times and FIFA. I'm sure I'm forgetting. So there was The Sun and Plebgate, and then Channel 4 News doing it in a slightly different, kind of coming from a different direction, but they were both significant stories. Channel 4 News doing Plebgate, and I'm sure I've missed out something. So, there are examples of, other people doing significant investigations, but I think I just outlined 4 big stories that Exaro has had that have had massive implications to varying degrees. And we've been going 4 years. And I think if you thought of any other media organisation, no one has had 4. The Guardian's had, I think, 1 or 2, because I think they might have done HSBC and tax avoidance. I think that was them, which was a big expose that was worth doing. Who else has had 4? So other people are doing things, but they could obviously be doing more. Fire away.
Do you think you've got an ethical obligation to do this sort of journalism? Do you think that's something that all journalists should be pursuing?
Well, yeah, I think all journalists should be, and I think all journalists should be to some degree. I mean, I keep coming back to the example of the sports scandals that sports journalists sort of missed or didn't expose, or the same could be said of MPs' expenses and political journalists. I think all journalists have a duty to do that, because that's what journalism is about. It's about finding out what's going on, invariably finding out something that someone in a position of power doesn't want anyone else to know about, finding out about it and telling the world about it. That is what journalism is. And we could do with a bit more of it.
Just a quick one, really. You talked about the fact that it was at the minute something that wasn't self-sustainable, what you were doing. How difficult can it be ethically to kind of have sustainable investigative journalism when you've got to rely on a source of income, and then you possibly think to yourself, why are those people sponsoring what I'm doing?
Yeah, well, in a sense, we're still exploring exactly how the business model will work for us. But at the moment, what we do, and I'm sure we'll continue to do this to some extent, is we partner up with other media organisations. So if we've got a big story, or even not necessarily this big, but a significant story that we think someone would like to run, then we might approach a newspaper or a television programme and see whether they want to break the story with us. And they'll pay us to do that, because we're obviously supplying the material. I mean, I have to say, in practice, in most cases, the vast majority of cases, whatever they pay won't really cover the cost of the work done. So it's a kind of contribution to the cost, but it's part of it. I think it's part of the answer. I don't think it's the whole answer. I think friends of mine in this field say you could never get more than 10% of your costs covered in this way. Well, we're doing better than that, but you couldn't get it all covered, because it's quite an expensive business, investigative journalism. Well, it is an expensive business, and the main expense is the time, is simply journalist time. And that's coming back to what I was saying earlier, the accountants being the villain of the piece, they argued against this. It's an expensive thing to do. You have to have journalists, doing a lot of work. You're not sure quite how much material is going to result. And at the end of the day, if it's that good a story, it's going to cause a stink. You know, you're going to have a row about it. If you think of every big significant investigative story down the years, I mean, I talked about Aitken many years ago. If you think of Cash for Questions, Snowden, all the stuff that we've done, you will always have people in positions of power. MP's expense, another one. You will always have the blowback from people in positions of power. And you'll also quite often have rival media who are jealous that they didn't get the story also attacking you. So, you know, coming back to the accountant's mentality, why go through all this? Why have the expense? Why have the potential litigation that may result? Why not just rewrite press releases? It's so much easier and so dull.
Time for one more question? Anybody? No?
How far would you be willing to go to get a story or to...
How far would I be willing to go? In what sense?
Well, would you break the law?
That's an interesting question. Well, it is an interesting question because I mean, I have always had a kind of hard and fast rule of never paying sources of any sort. And that's the policy at Exaro. We do not pay sources, and let alone public officials. Now, of course, you know, in the past, I would have thought that paying a public official is clearly breaking the law. However, we've just had a series of juries looking at specific instances where some journalists did pay public officials for stories. And the argument was, in particular cases, that the stories had strong public interest, and genuinely that argument could be made for many of those stories. And I have to say, although I think juries are more sensible than, you know, top prosecutors at the CPS, I've been surprised by the extent to which juries have willingly accepted that argument. In other words, they've accepted it more willingly than I would have expected. So it has made me, we haven't changed our policy, but I am sitting here thinking, well, maybe we should be paying public officials in certain cases. You know, if, for example, someone came forward with a document that showed comprehensively, you know, absolutely proved beyond doubt, you know, that something scandalous happened, well, it seems to me that juries believe that that's a legal thing to do. Not quite how the law appears to be in terms of how it's framed. So I guess in that situation, one would have to take a judgment at the time. So no, I mean, I wouldn't break the law, except for one. There is one exception, of course. And it's one that every journalist should be willing to do. If you do have a confidential source, and again, I'm not quite sure what kind of journalist you can be if you don't have at least one, there may come a point in time where someone, presumably the party that you're exposing, wants to know who your confidential source is. I mean, I have actually been threatened with breaking the Official Secrets Act, prosecution for breaking the Official Secrets Act, on the grounds that I revealed something that MI6 didn't want me to reveal about them. They never liked that. What they really wanted, they didn't really want to prosecute me. What they wanted was to know who my source was. They thought I had a particular source inside the organisation. And what they really wanted was to know who that was. So they made the threat in order to try to prise out of me who the source was. Well, I told them to get lost over quite a lengthy meeting. And the threat went away once they realised that they just weren't going to get it. So one thing I was just going to finish on was, with confidential sources, you may find yourself in a situation where a court order is actually made telling you must disclose who the confidential source is. It actually happened to a friend of mine, a colleague of mine called Bill Goodwin, who was the kind of test case on this. Court orders made, you must disclose who the confidential source is. As a journalist, you are duty-bound to refuse to comply. And by doing so, you are now in contempt of court, which is criminal, and Bill was fined. It is a criminal act, you can be jailed for that. And of course, the European Court of Human Rights in the end decided, quite rightly, that that was a fundamental breach of free expression. People can't freely express themselves if you as a journalist can't have confidential sources, so it was overturned. But in the interim, it might mean breaking the law.
I just wanted to leave a little bit of time at the end here, because we are running out of time, so I wanted to throw in the last question. What do you look for in people who apply to you for jobs or work placement? What core skills, what core characteristics do you look for?
In terms of graduates?
Graduates or trainee journalists? Excuse
Yeah,
me.
yeah. Well, there are quite a few things that I suppose we're looking for at Exaro. I suppose they come into two broad areas. I mean, you're probably going to be doing, if you're working for Exaro, quite a lot of heavy research. So you actually need to be really quite bright and quite adept at finding material, perhaps finding material online, finding research papers, and being able to make sense of them. But I think, so that there's that general kind of precision and, you know, capability to be able to adapt to doing that kind of work, which is probably comes down to precision and actually being quite bright. And then separate from that, I would say is, words actually gone out of my head, but being able to come up with ideas and kind of being able to lateral thinking.
Yeah. Okay. What about the core skills of honesty, integrity, reliability?
Yeah, I mean, of course. I mean, that's all. It's just a given.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
Right. Mark will hopefully have some time to speak to anyone who's that enthusiastic about the possibility of joining Exaro later. But for the meantime, I'd just like everybody to thank you for coming.